All right, everyone, welcome back. We're going to get into our second spotlight now, which is with Dr. Heidi Ellis, the director of Boston Children's Hospital Trauma and Community Resilience Center. And Dr. Ellis will explore the trauma systems therapy framework for refugees. The stress that child refugees and migrants experience does not end with their journeys. Beyond the traumatic stress that can result from persecution, violence, or dangerous living conditions they are fleeing, children may experience compounding stress as a result of resettlement, acculturation, and isolation. Drawing on the resilience of children while recognizing their unique therapy needs to overcome this trauma, Dr. Ellis will present her pioneering Trauma Systems Therapy Refugees, or TST-R framework, which addresses social, environmental, and system of care factors and employs components of prevention and intervention to improve outcomes for young people. Welcome, Dr. Ellis.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I think I'm mic'd here. Do I need?
You're good.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Really nice to be talking in front of real people. This is my first time in 2 years that I'm not talking to a Zoom screen, so I'm really excited. And if I mute myself halfway through, I apologize. Let me start today, go to the next slide, by introducing you to the boy that introduced me to refugee mental health care. It's not really his picture. His name is not really Egal, but I'll say it is. But there really was a boy who was 12 years old when I met him. I was doing my clinical internship at Boston Medical Center. He was a refugee from Somalia. Somalia had been in a state of widespread violence and upheaval since before he was born. And when he was 8 years old, he witnessed his parents killed in front of him. At that stage, his grandparents, out of fear for the safety of him and their whole family, fled to neighboring Kenya, where for several years, they lived in a refugee camp. When at age 11, they were resettled to the United States, they thought the worst was behind them. But there they were in my office about a year later, holding a piece of paper from the school that said that Egal needed a mental health evaluation before he could return to school. According to the school, he was unmanageable. He was getting in fights, knocking over chairs. He seemed unable to learn. And the grandparents, through an interpreter, explained to me that he didn't need therapy. He wasn't crazy. All they needed was my signature so they could get on about the business of him getting educated. That fall, somewhat by chance, I had several more young refugees referred to my caseload. Each one had their own story, and yet across them all, the same themes came up again and again. First, they had all experienced horrific trauma and upheaval. Second, none of them were interested in therapy. They didn't really want to be in my office. And they didn't see the problem as one of mental health. And talking to a stranger was certainly not the solution that they were looking for. So that could have been the end of the story. In my business, sometimes people just write, treatment resistant, evaluated, doesn't wish to return, and your job is done. What can you do? But I was really bothered by something, which is that the other thing I saw about these kids was that they were struggling. Their families had moved heaven and earth to get them to a place of safety. And now these children I was seeing were not able to do the tasks of childhood, to learn and make friends and be part of their communities and move forward with their hopes and dreams. And what really struck me was that our system of care that was supposed to be helping these kids was instead failing them. So next slide, please. This launched for me a few questions. I'm going to move out here so I can actually see the slides. First of all, what was going on? Why was Egal having so much trouble? What was behind the way he was acting? Second of all, what could we do to help? Because it was clear what we were trying to do was not helpful. And third, what's at stake if we ignore him? Because the truth was we were ignoring him. Kids like Egal didn't fit our system. And so they were just falling through the cracks and not returning. Next slide. So let's start with this first question. What was behind the way he was acting? And more academically sounding, what key experiences pre and post resettlement were associated with this poor mental health that we were seeing for Egal or kids like him? Next slide. The thinking I do is grounded in the social ecological model by Uri Bronfenbrenner, which you may be familiar with. But the basic idea is that an individual child is nested within layers of the social ecology. So they have a family and a community and a peer group, they live in a neighborhood, and around all of that is society and culture, sometimes more than one culture if you're coming from a different cultural background. Disruptions in any one layer of this social ecology have profound implications for the developing child at its core. Next slide. So let's think about Egal or kids like him and what that social ecology looks like during war or migration periods. If you think about it, every layer of that social ecology had profound disruptions. I often talk about it in terms of like the basic scaffolding of childhood. The structures we expect to be there to help children grow and flourish often are just torn apart in the context of war and migration. So having a functioning school, having clean drinking water and food, a safe neighborhood, your family being intact and together and being able to have that sort of experience of stability that we want our kids to have. And for refugees, even at that outer layer, thinking about culture, the very definition of refugee has embedded in it this idea that someone is targeted for their identity and beliefs. So even that part of the social ecology has been under pressure and fire. Next slide, please. I wanted to understand what these factors looked like for kids who are refugees. So I started a research project called the Somali Youth Experience Project. I interviewed 144 Somali adolescents who are living in New England, a very community-based sample. These were not kids who were clinically, coming out of the clinic for any particular reason. So it was very widespread community-based sample. And let me just share a few of the things that we found in this study. Next slide. Okay, first of all, this was not a big surprise, but it's very important to understand trauma exposure was nearly ubiquitous. So within our sample, 94% reported that they had been exposed to a traumatic event. On average, they had experienced 7 traumatic events. Next slide, please. And what do I mean when I talk about that? Well, 70% had witnessed violence such as killing or armed combat. Almost half had personally been assaulted or injured. Roughly a third thought they would be killed. 43% had a loved one killed, like Egal. About half had endured prolonged separations from loved ones. And I want you to think about what that means in the context of all these other traumas that they're experiencing. So at the time that these sorts of things are happening, they may not have been near the family that was most central to protecting them and making them feel safe and loved. And then roughly a third had experienced extreme deprivation, so going without food or water so long that they thought they might die. Next slide, please. Okay, when I put this slide up, I'm never sure whether I should say, so not surprisingly, roughly a third had symptoms of PTSD, or if I should say, unbelievably, roughly a third did not have symptoms of PTSD. And both stories are important to hold on to in this. And they're both true. Some go on to develop problems and some show remarkable mental health resilience in the face of it all. Next slide, please. Okay, so then the post-migration context. Refugees, the word refuge, right? This is what is supposed to be a safe harbor from those terrible experiences that we just saw on that slide. But the truth is, it's anything but for a lot of families. There is continuing disruption, the stress of acculturation, resettlement stressors, parents trying to get their feet on the ground in a country where their skill sets may not transfer. The stress of resettlement is enormous. And amongst that is discrimination and the incredibly challenging scenario of a country that doesn't understand one's religion, race, ethnicity, and treats somebody as lesser. Next slide, please. Okay, so we took all these factors. We wanted to understand Oh, so what's behind mental health problems? Not surprisingly, trauma was associated with PTSD, but so was resettlement stress, acculturative stress, and perceived discrimination. Next slide, please. If you look at depression, trauma was again significant, but much more significant was the experience of discrimination. So this begins to point us towards the importance of looking not just historically at what happened over there and back then, but right now. What are we doing in our communities that is exacerbating the mental health problems of these kids? Next slide. Here's a quote from one of our Somali adolescents. People don't know the difference between who bombed them and who's Muslim. They just treat you the same. All of you are bad. And I think what that data we just saw is showing is that in some ways, what's happening here in our communities is more toxic than the war that they went through. Okay, next slide, please. And in case you thought that was just way back then, post 9/11, this is actually a longitudinal study that follows Somali young adults over 6 years. And what it essentially is showing is that mental health symptoms track almost perfectly with discrimination, and in fact seem to be largely predicted by discrimination levels. And starting in 2016, there was a sudden increase in discrimination. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's move to the important part. What can we do to help? What kinds of mental health services do Somali youth access? And what other kinds of help-seeking pathways occur in the community? Next slide. First of all, very few get services in a standard system. So we took the most symptomatic part of our sample and found that 92% had never sought or received any kind of mental health service. Next slide, please. Why 8%? We keep going, next slide. We're gonna move to the heart of it here. Talking to a therapist, that's something we laugh at in our culture because we're like, why would you wanna talk about your issues? Somalis don't seek therapy. Next slide. We looked at our qualitative data to understand where they did go. And what we found is that there are a lot of turning to supports within the community, religious leaders. If things really, really got bad, you had two alternatives. You could send your child back to Somalia or send them to a mental health professional. And those were viewed as sort of similarly dire. Next slide, please. What we also saw, though, was that there was this room here for what I think of as culturally responsive care. Something that built on religion, community, the natural healing systems like school, and could respond to the strengths of the culture in the process of the work. Next slide, please. All right, so we developed a treatment model called Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees. Its implementation in Boston was called Project Shifa, and I want to show you a 5-minute video about how we put the data together in partnership with the community, came up with a program. Go ahead.
There are a lot of refugee and immigrant communities in the United States. Many of these youth are coming here after having experienced incredible adversity and trauma. The resettlement process is really extremely difficult, and for some of them, they go on to develop mental health problems that can really interfere with their ability to be part of their communities.
If you have no provision for those children to express their sadness, they will express it in other ways.
The children's ability to be successful as learners is at stake. It was more like benign neglect. Differentiating between the naughtiness of a typical 13-year-old and a response to trauma takes a little bit of training. Sometimes we intervened with consequences when what was needed was mental health supports.
What we've done is embed our mental health services in a school system. Kids are coming anyway. The school system is really valued. Education is highly valued by families.
If I'm school-based, it's part of the school. It's part of the school day. Parents feel this is something that's acceptable and okay. We work a lot with teachers and social workers for children who may be needing extra intervention. If a child has had a trauma history, we are very much available to the teachers. We do trainings on trauma and culture, and we also do groups.
Within the school, we run groups for all the kids in the English language learners classroom.
What did you just say?
I just said I feel comfortable staying here.
You do? Okay. Do you think we can talk about goals that we have for the school year?
Yeah. To play soccer.
To play soccer.
Do you remember how we made the group goals last year? What do we want to accomplish?
Learn how to respect each other.
To behave.
Yeah, you want to color?
If a child begins to show significant mental health needs, it's a very easy next step to go to the family and say, you know, we've been meeting with so-and-so in the group. He's really benefiting from it. I think you might really also benefit from meeting individually. And in fact, maybe we could work with your family also. Here's what we're seeing and here's what we're thinking we might do.
We were talking about talking to mom more. He worries a lot about her, and if we can start a communication where we actually ease his anxiety by talking about how safe mom is, reframing his concern.
It makes perfect sense. If he comes from a refugee camp where he was in chronic danger, he's walking home from school, he's in chronic danger, why would he believe that anyone in his family is safe until we actually address the core issue of safety? So I'll be curious.
It's so important that when you create a program, it takes into consideration the way that people relate to each other in a culture. Especially when we're talking about the needs of children, that we're expecting parents to trust us, caring for their children, helping their children. We want them to know we are there for the family.
There were no Somali social workers in the entire state of Massachusetts before we started this program. We partnered with Boston University School of Social Work, and they provided 2 full scholarships and mentoring and training to 2 individuals from the Somali community.
So then they all talked about how in Somalia there is healthy and mad, but then in America you have depressed, anxiety, you have all these things.
And there's no Somali definition of those words. And that's
One of the big successes for us has been that we've started to have families ask for services, saying, how can I get my child in to be part of this program?
maya behaviorka other schools ay jiro Boston programkan ma laga yaabaa ina aad balaarisaan oo
gabdhaha dhaqan ku dhagan ya
macnaha iskuulka markaas ay soo galaan miiska iskaga istaagi jireen ma ay aqoon.
These kids are part of our communities, and kids in our communities do well. We all do well.
Thank you. So that was our initial implementation in Boston that was funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We have since adapted it for different cultural groups, and there are sites in probably 15 places around the country who do trauma systems therapy for refugees. Next slide. And the basic idea behind it, if you were able to get that from the video, is that we take that social ecology and we say, you know what, we need to do 2 things. We need to work from the inside out, building the child's skills so they can better navigate the stressors of life. But we need to work from the outside in too. We need to look at our social environment, look at the school environment and the family, and think about what can we do to alleviate some of those stressors that are driving these mental health symptoms for our kids. Next slide, please. We found outcomes on a number of different levels that looked really great. Near and dear to my heart was family engagement, which felt so core, but we also saw decreases in a culture of stress in the family, an increased sense of belonging at school, and decreased experiences of discrimination. And then the more traditional metrics like decreases in PTSD and depression. Next slide. Okay, my last question. What's at stake if we ignore Egal and kids like him? And I'm just going to leave you with the questions to think about. What does it mean to have a system that systematically fails to meet the needs of our kids and families? And what would it mean if instead we found a way for each kid to feel safe, valued, and that they belong? Thank you.